The docking protocols for Veth'ai vessels were 47 pages long, and Naomi had read all of them twice, which was 47 pages more than anyone else on Medina Station's liaison staff had bothered with. That was fine. She was used to being the only person in the room who had done the reading. She stood at Bay 31's environmental seal and watched the Veth'ai shuttle nose into the dock with the kind of precise, unhurried confidence that only came from either excellent piloting or extremely good autopilot, and she couldn't tell which from here. The hull was the color of old bone. The docking clamps engaged with a sound like a very large knuckle cracking. Martinez, the station's political attaché, appeared at her elbow. He smelled like the good coffee from the Level 2 canteen, which meant he'd been up there while she'd been down here for the last 3 hours running a pre-arrival environmental check. "How bad is it?" he said. "The dock? Fine. I rerouted the atmospheric intake on Junction 7 because the primary had a microfracture, and I didn't want a decompression incident as a first impression. I meant the politics. The politics aren't my department." He looked at the tablet in her hand. "Is that the 47 page? 48, there's an appendix." He stopped looking at the tablet. The airlock cycled. The seal equalized with a soft exhalation of recycled air that smelled faintly of something Naomi didn't have a word for. Not bad, just not human. She'd smelled it before, on the cargo runs out past Illis. She hadn't liked it then either. The Veth'ai came through in a specific order. She'd read about this. Rank moved in the middle, flanked, never leading. 3 members of what the protocols called an operational escort, taller than average, wearing the same neutral gray-green that the documents described as administrative dress, and then, between them, the Matriarch-Regent. She was smaller than Naomi expected. The briefing materials had used words like formidable and politically consequential, and Naomi had built a shape around those words that turned out to be wrong. The matriarch was compact. Her face had the quality of something that had been weathered by high pressure rather than time. Her eyes tracked the bay in a single long sweep. Walls, ceiling, intake junction, the human standing near the far wall, back to the walls, in the way of someone running a structural assessment, not a social one. Behind her and slightly to the left was her daughter. The briefing materials had not mentioned the daughter was coming. Naomi noted this, noted also that Martinez was already starting the kind of smile that politicians deployed when they needed to look informed and weren't, and went back to her tablet. The atmospheric readings were fine. Junction 7 was holding. She didn't need to check, but she checked anyway. The protocol said that greetings in the public register were the responsibility of the political attaché. Martinez stepped forward and said, in careful, practiced Veth'ai public tongue, "We receive you in good faith and open pressure." The matriarch's response in the same register was flawless. She said the words that meant welcome accepted, and the words that meant we acknowledge equivalent standing, and then she turned to her daughter and said, in a completely different register, lower in register, tighter in construction, the syntax that operated on a different harmonic, something that Naomi didn't react to. She was very careful not to react to it. What the matriarch had said, in the inner tongue, in the register that Veth'ai used only among bloodkin, and that the entire diplomatic briefing had described as wholly inaccessible to human cognition, was, "The air filtration here is competent." It was not a compliment exactly. It was an observation. The kind of observation you made when you walked into a place and found it maintained beyond expectation. Naomi looked at her tablet. Junction 7, nominal, atmospheric blend, within tolerance. CO2 scrub running at 93%, which was better than the 90 she'd set it to because she'd recalibrated the secondary loop at 200 and hadn't logged it yet. She made a note to log it. The matriarch's name was Veth'ai Matriarch-Regent, and she had been ruling her faction's docking interests in this sector for 11 years, which in Veth'ai political terms was approximately forever. Her daughter's name was Saya, and she was here as the official interpreter, which meant she translated between the public register and standard and English, and she was, by any professional measure, excellent at it. She was also the kind of excellent that Naomi recognized from engineering, the kind that looked effortless because it had been built on an enormous amount of work that nobody watched. The initial meeting was held in Bay 31's conference annex, which Naomi had also checked that morning because the CO2 sensor in the far corner had been reading high since the third shift last week, and she'd wanted to replace the unit before the Veth'ai arrived. She had replaced it. Nobody had noticed. That was also fine. She sat at the table's far end with her tablet. Her job was technical liaison, which in practice meant she answered questions about the station's infrastructure and translated engineering concerns into language that political people could use, and mostly she was here to be called on rather than to speak. She was not here to have opinions. She was not here to do anything except answer the questions she was asked and read the room's CO2 data, and not make Martinez look like the underprepared political functionary that he was, which was going to be a challenge, but she'd worked with harder constraints. The matriarch sat across from Martinez. Saya sat beside her mother and slightly behind, the position the protocols described as interpretive proximity, and she translated the opening terms of the docking rights discussion with the clean economy of someone who had stopped needing to think about the words years ago. Naomi read the CO2 sensor data from the corner unit. Nominal, good. The matriarch spoke in the public register, which Saya translated, and Martinez responded in standard, which Saya translated back. And it was going fine. The way these things went fine when the actual disagreement hadn't surfaced yet, and everyone was still performing goodwill. Then the matriarch turned to her daughter and said, in the inner tongue, very quietly, "She has checked this room." Saya's hands moved in what Naomi had learned. Over 18 months of cargo runs and 4 months of serious study was the Veth'ai equivalent of a nod. The matriarch said, "The atmospheric unit in the far corner is new." Saya said, "Yes, it is." The matriarch said, "The rest of the room is older, but the filtration lines have been rerouted recently. You can see it in the ceiling paneling, the new coupling at Junction 3. A pause. Then, this station sends its technical staff to meetings. Another pause, different weight, interesting. Naomi was looking at her tablet. Her face was doing nothing in particular. She had a very useful face. It had gotten her through 3 years of cargo negotiations on the outer runs, through a labor dispute on Tycho that had gotten ugly enough that 2 people were fired, and 1 went into medical, through the 18 months she had spent picking up the inner tongue from a Veth'ai cargo coordinator named Razeth, who had found the entire project so improbable that he'd helped her out of something between professional courtesy and amusement. She had a face that could hold a significant quantity of information completely still. She was using it now. She thought about Junction 3, the coupling, whether she'd made the rerouting obvious or whether the matriarch was simply the kind of person who read rooms the way other people breathed. She decided it didn't matter and thought about it anyway. Then Martinez was saying something about transit corridor access, and she needed to pay attention in case he got the structural limits wrong. He got the structural limits wrong. She said, without looking up, the transit corridor can support a standard Veth'ai configuration up to 12 vessels at a time. The briefing listed 14, but 2 of those berths are on the repair rotation and won't be back until the 3rd cycle. Martinez looked at her. She looked at the table. Saya translated. The matriarch listened. Then the matriarch looked at Naomi for a moment, not long, not dramatically, the way you might look at a structural element you hadn't expected to be load-bearing, and said something in the public register that Saya translated as, "Understood. We will plan for 12." What she had said in the inner tongue before and beneath and between the public register words, so quietly it was almost texture rather than speech, was good. And then to Saya, still in the inner tongue, she corrected her own station's error. And Saya said, yes. And the matriarch said, without being asked. Naomi made a note on her tablet. The note said, check third cycle repair schedule, confirm birth return date before afternoon session. It was a necessary note. It had nothing to do with the fact that her handwriting was slightly worse than usual. She made the note and moved on. The afternoon session broke for what the protocol called atmospheric equilibration, which was a dignified way of saying that the Veth'ai needed to spend 40 minutes in a higher humidity environment, and the humans needed coffee. Naomi took her standing up, near the window that looked out over the dock. The Veth'ai shuttle sat in Bay 31 with the patient solidity of something that had been doing this for a long time. Good design. The coupling flanges were non-standard, but they'd meshed with the station's clamps without any drama, which meant either the Veth'ai had researched the dock specifications in advance or their engineering tolerances were wide enough to absorb the difference. Either one was a reasonable way to operate. She respected both approaches. She was cataloging the hull plating patterns, older manufacture on the port side, newer on the starboard, patched somewhere around the midsection with material that didn't quite match, competent work though, when she heard someone come to stand beside her. She turned slightly. Saya was holding a cup of something that wasn't coffee. She was looking at the shuttle. She said, in standard, without preamble, "You corrected the transit corridor number." It was wrong. Yes, a pause. Martinez was not pleased. Martinez will be happier with 12 vessels that actually fit than with 14 that cause an incident. Saya considered this. She had the quality of someone who considered things properly before responding, which Naomi found professionally congenial. He did not seem to take it that way. He doesn't have to take it any particular way. The structural limits are what they are. Saya looked at the cup in her hands. The cup had a slight ridge on one side that she was running her thumb along, not hard enough to be agitation, just something for the hands to do during a conversation that was going somewhere oblique, and both of them knew it. My mother wishes to know the formal title of your role on the station. Technical liaison. She has not encountered this role at other stations. Most send a dedicated diplomatic engineer for negotiations of this scale. We don't have one, so they send me. And what do you do when there is no negotiation? Fix things. Saya looked at the window again. The shuttle sat there. The clamps held. Naomi drank her coffee and waited because this conversation wasn't done and pushing it would make it take longer. She will ask you questions this afternoon, Saya said, about the infrastructure, about the station's operational capacity. Is that acceptable? That's what I'm here for. She may ask about things outside the standard liaison scope. Naomi looked at her, like what? Saya's thumb moved along the ridge of the cup. She is thorough. When she is interested in a problem, she follows it where it goes. Another pause. She is interested in how this station operates. The station operates fine. Yes, Saya said. I think that is what interests her. She went back to her mother. Naomi looked at the shuttle, the patched section on the mid-hull. Whoever had done the repair had known what they were doing. The plate edges were clean. The ceiling line was consistent. The material mismatch was cosmetic only. Someone had fixed a serious problem and fixed it right with whatever was available and then gotten back to work. She finished her coffee. She did not think about what the matriarch had said to her daughter 20 minutes ago in the inner tongue, in the register that no human was supposed to understand, in the brief gap between the public register closing of the morning session and the formal break. She had been making her note about the repair schedule. The matriarch had been speaking to Saya quietly in the private language that sealed everything it touched. She had said, the engineer, find out who she is. Her position, her tenure, her standing. Saya had said, "Why?" And the matriarch had said, "Because I am thinking about the third decade," which was a Veth'ai expression. Naomi had learned it from Razeth, over a long cargo run past the Laconia gate, while she'd been drilling the inner tongue's tonal distinctions, and he'd been explaining that Veth'ai marriages were arranged in terms of what the family would look like in 30 years, not in terms of what anyone wanted now. The third decade meant, I am thinking about who we will need to be. Naomi looked at the shuttle. The clamps were holding, the hull patch was solid, the afternoon session was going to start in 20 minutes. She went to get more coffee.